Boondevil is this huge, monstrous creature that is green with big yellow eyes, kind of an owl-like face, but about the size of a Sasquatch, that lives in a cave on their property. And of course they had heard this growing up their whole life and thought their grandmother was completely effing insane, right? Cool. So they're out there, there's a huge, kind of lake on their property, river runs into it, cave system. He says he's out there walking with his sister in the middle of the day and looks up, and it's right in front of them on a tree. And it moves down and is looking right at him to the point where he couldn't move. Literally, his sister kept moving and kind of ran into him, and she's like, what? And he's like, Anyway, they ended up grabbing each other and running back to the house, right? So he tells this story because he was not a believer at all in anything. He thought it was crazy until he saw it for himself, which a lot of people have that. They think people are nuts until, the boogeyman jumps out.
I see it.
So they go running back to the house and are trying to explain, and she's like, I told you. The Boondevil. And what this apparently was, the rumor for the household was that the Native Americans summoned it when Daniel Boone was around. And its job was to go tear apart the forts that were being built. So, I have a whole theory about summoning things but not putting the ending to the spell and you just leave it there. But apparently it eats big catfish. And so we read this listener story on our podcast. I thought it was fascinating. I was like, okay, a little cryptid, no verification. 2 days after we aired the podcast, right, which is us reading a story. We didn't embellish it. We literally read this story. And I was like, nope, I'm never going to that property ever. Thank you, hard pass. But, and that's my theory on most things. I don't have to outrun my enemies, just my friends. Okay, so we get this. So then we get this email from a professor in Kentucky explaining to us in great detail how dare we read this on the podcast. We are totally off base. He has been a professor for years. This thing doesn't exist. Well, first of all, I'm like, it was a listener story, my friend. Thank you for listening to our podcast, But we actually ended up reading this on the air, this letter from him, because he was so mad. It was 3 pages of how wrong we were.
All the historical inaccuracies and all this other stuff. And then what was funny, though, was literally the 2 emails later was somebody else from that area who said, oh my God, I thought we were the only people who knew this story. I live on that property. I've heard about this monster my whole life. My dad's seen it. My grandpa's seen it. My uncle's seen it. And it's like, okay.
And then we got another one. And it just sort of landslid to the point where people have come up to us when we've been up in that area going, I loved your episode on the Boondevil. And I was like, we didn't have an episode on the Boondevil because we read a story. But there are so many families up there that knew exactly what this thing was. And that's how these stories kind of get shared. Or, you don't believe your grandma or your Meemaw who's telling you this story, and until you run into it on the property and then almost pee your pants in front of your sister and have to run away.